So welcome everyone. My name is Deborah Poff. I'm the past chair of COPE. Welcome to the 2021 COPE seminar. This session is on reducing the inadvertent spread of retracted science. We have three speakers today. I'm going to introduce them in order of their talk. And what we'll do is Jody will pass it to Daniel when she's finished, and Daniel will pass it to Jeff, and then we'll entertain questions for the time we have left. Jody is currently the PI of an interesting study on reducing the inadvertent spread of retracted science. Her recent work has focused on topics such as systematic review automation, semantic publication, and the citation of retracted papers. She's had funding from the NIH, the IMLS, the Alfred Sloan Foundation, which is our current program of research, and the NSF. Daniel Finelli is a fellow in quantitative methodology at the London School of Economics, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. He has conducted numerous influential studies on research misconduct, including analyses on retractions. He's also a member of the Committee on Ethics and Bioethics of Italy's CNR and the Luxembourg Agency for Research Integrity. Jeffrey Bilder is the Director of Technology and Research at Crossref. He's led the technical development and launch of a number of industry initiatives at Crossref, including Similarity Check, formerly Crosscheck, Crossmark, ORCID, and the Open Fund Registry, which was formerly known as FundRef. And without further ado, I'll hand over the mic to Jody.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be speaking with all of you this morning, this afternoon, this evening, whatever time it is where you are. My talk is about the continued citation of retracted science and what we can do about it, drawing on the Sloan-funded project that Deborah, Danielle, Jeff, and others have been a part of. I don't think it's necessary to this audience to say what retraction is, but this is how I try to frame the work that I'm doing, and particularly to think about retraction as focusing on alerting readers to articles that are seriously flawed, that can't be relied on, that their findings can't be relied on. And that the goal, according to the COPE guidelines, one goal is to minimize the number of researchers who cite the erroneous work or act on its findings or draw incorrect conclusions from using redundant publications in synthesis. Unfortunately, for about 30 years, researchers, particularly in information science, bibliometrics, scientometrics, have been noticing that there continually is citation of retracted papers. This is an investigative journalist, Charles Pillar, looked in early this year about 2 papers related to COVID-19 from the Surgisphere retractions. They were alive in the literature for about a month. And they now have, I think at this point, they have over 1,000 citations each. Science Magazine looked at 200 of the post-retraction citations and concluded that over half inappropriately cited the retracted articles. It turns out that half is actually pretty good in this space. The work that I've done with a PhD student at Illinois showed that if we look at biomedicine, 94% of post-retraction citations did not show awareness of the retraction. This is based on a large-scale study where we looked at every retracted paper in PubMed and all the open access papers we could get a hold of for citations in PubMed Central. We see that the way that people are citing these articles is really just as though they were normal science. Even in where in the article they're looking, there's just no difference in where the papers are cited before they're retracted and after they're retracted. So this says to me that authors generally, when they're citing retracted papers after the retraction, don't seem to be aware, and this is a problem. This is the kind of observation that led to this Sloan-funded stakeholder consultation, where this time last year, we were gathering in a 3-part online workshop to talk about what could we do. And my team has been looking at various things throughout. The recommendations that have come out of this process are really 4 main recommendations. One is to develop a systematic cross-industry approach to ensure the public availability of consistent, standardized, interoperable, and timely information about retractions. Another is to recommend a taxonomy of retraction categories and classifications. And some folks have done some of that work to think about what's the metadata just at the very, very basic level of what's the difference between, say, a withdrawal and a retraction, and when should we use different terms and what should they mean. The third recommendation is to develop best practices for coordinating the retraction process to enable timely, fair, and unbiased outcomes. And there's been great work on, again, many, I think, involved here in thinking about institutions alongside. I think there's a lot more work to do, particularly in the space of authors and editors and journals, to think about not just the coordination of the process of retraction itself, but what happens afterwards. And we'll talk a little bit about that, where things are going. The fourth recommendation is to educate stakeholders about publication correction processes. And I'd like to see this as a continuum, right? That it's not just the process that you do before something is published in peer review. And retraction is not the only answer to finding problems with the literature, but there's a whole continuum. And I think that there's a lot of need to think about, particularly how do we incentivize correcting the literature, how do we destigmatize when that's appropriate, and so on. So these recommendations we put into a very long recommendations document, and then also into a short summary, which is now a preprint under review with research integrity and peer review. You can take a look at it on the Research Square in Review platform there. Hopefully we'll be proceeding and getting reviews of that soon and taking that forward. One opportunity, if this is an area that's of interest to you, NISO, the National Information Standards Organization that's based in the US, just announced about a week ago that they're starting a standards development process. This is called COREC, Communication of Retractions, Removals, and Expressions of Concern. And it's focusing not about the retraction itself, but about communicating. Once something has been retracted, what information needs to be shared, what metadata needs to be shared, what are the interoperability standards for getting that information from the publisher to aggregators and to databases and to search engines, and what sort of display standards. We have a lot of variety, and colleagues like Liz Silzer have looked very explicitly at even the same publisher may indicate that something is retracted in different ways in the same exact venue. It's very hard for readers to take account. So how do we address the metadata, the interoperability, the display standards? That's what this NISO group is going to work on. If it's interesting, volunteer to participate or write for more information. NISO headquarters is pulling that. So NISO HQ at niso.org would be the folks to get a hold of. Very delighted to talk more about folks with any of these things. So do type your chats and questions into the Q&A. And with that, I will be turning this over to Danielle.
Great pleasure to be here, and great pleasure to see so many participants. And as Jody mentioned, I'm basically here, I suppose, primarily in the role of reporting a little bit on this subcommittee on the retraction taxonomy. But I thought I'd take this opportunity to also add a little bit of a commentary to the work that we did, which really picks up on what has been, I would say, for everyone, as the most interesting aspect of the discussion that we had, which revolved around this idea of a removal retraction category, and why we couldn't agree on having one, and why, particularly in my opinion at least, there are several arguments against it. So first of all, as already Jody mentioned, the committee itself was tasked fundamentally with the mission of simplifying the taxonomy of retraction of, let's say, amendment categories in order to facilitate the electronic tagging of these amendments and therefore the correction of the literature. And it didn't take us very long, actually, to agree on a set of 5 categories that seemed to capture with adequate accuracy the different types and different levels of amendments currently used. There was a 6th category, a removal type of retraction, that was proposed, but again, didn't reach consensus. And so it's not formally included in the list of 5. And now I'm going to articulate a little bit more why. Before I do so, I'd like to premise that in part of my own work, which saw as part of, if anything, in the role of advisory, some of the members of the subcommittee as well, when we were trying to propose something quite different, and in fact, a sort of a broader and more articulate kind of taxonomy for retractions, we did include a category of removal for articles that presented an immediate risk for the public in terms of the information they contained, for example. So I wasn't, at least time ago, in principle against this idea, but it certainly changed my mind now, and I'll explain why. This is not quite in the report. In the report itself, the arguments in favor of the removal are pretty much the same that I think were always there, in terms of you would want to remove an article that presents some kind of risk for the public. And so if there are obviously sort of security risks, if there are severe breaches, for example, of individuals' rights to privacy. But then, and I don't quite remember how we were discussing this issue at the time, but it was definitely now in the proposal for a removal, in its definition at least, the idea that articles might be perpetrating harmful stereotypes or harmful inequities of some kind, such as racism, and therefore, again, their content is sort of damaging in some sense, and therefore ought to be removed, not just retracted. Now, in the report itself, the main argument against sort of including this removal category is, if you like, more of a technical one, because the task of the committee, as I mentioned, was that of really just simplifying what is already out there in terms of common forms of amendment. And this removal category isn't quite formally adopted by, as far as I know, most journals. It is certainly not one of the categories that immediately spring to mind. And therefore the argument was, well, there might be space for work on thinking about new forms of retractions, including this one, and this work should take place elsewhere. So this is why I think this is an interesting opportunity to invite perhaps a preliminary exchange of thoughts as to whether, for example, a category of removal should be included, and I am going to advance arguments as to why I don't think it should. And the basic idea being that it is too easily subject to abuse. There is, I think, unequivocal evidence that scholarship is under attack. You might have heard, for example, that there was a recently established new journal in philosophy called the Journal of Controversial Ideas, whose main innovation, so to speak, is to allow scholars to publish under a pseudonym in order explicitly to protect themselves from threats to their careers or their physical safety. And there seems to be a trend which is certainly quite well advanced, let's say, in the United States, where, for example, this very recent report documents several hundred cases of scholars that have been targeted in various ways for ideas they expressed, ideas that have very often to do with topics that are particularly at the moment, or as we all know, quite sensitive and controversial, but also a variety of other topics. And this report breaks down this phenomenon, showing how it is not sort of a partisan political phenomenon. It is manifested in a variety of different ways. It is simply a trend that seems what would appear, at least to me, a growing level of intolerance towards controversial ideas in scholarship. And part of the reaction to, again, ideas that are felt to be offensive or controversial is already that of requiring retractions. Retractions that I'm going to define, trying genuinely to be sort of neutral about them, as non-epistemic, in the sense that there's technically nothing wrong seemingly with these articles. They're just deemed to be, again, sort of contributing ideas that are unacceptable or sort of undesirable. And here are, for example, 3 retractions taken from this article that documents other related phenomena. And I think these are interesting examples because the topics of what was being retracted here that you see highlighted are, at least to my light, not immediately obviously harmful. And so these are good examples, for example, to question how easy it could ever be to draw a clear line between what is legitimate but controversial, and therefore you might call it thought-provoking scholarship, and articles that perpetrate harmful stereotypes, and therefore we would want to remove. And these types of retractions, by the way, are not just concerning recent articles, but also very old ones, for example. And here's a telling example of a recent retraction of an article that had been published in 1951. And the editors agreed with the argument advanced that this article was, again, sort of surpassed in its contents and quite, if you like, offensive or harmful, again, in the sense said before. And therefore they retracted it, but they also kept it in the archives of the journal for its historical value. And this, I think, is a good example to bring up a few points more. So first of all, these types of highly retrospective retractions, let's say, make the case in and of themselves that whatever values we're going to use to make these judgments about what is no longer acceptable in the scientific literature are subject to continuous change. And therefore, again, the threshold here seems very arbitrary. Second of all, it also highlights the fact, as in the thinking of the editors of this journal, that there is more to simply the content of a scientific article to the value of the article itself. And therefore, there's something to be preserved about the scientific literature beyond, again, the specific contents. And by the way, even if an article was actually technically removed from the scientific literature, it's never going to disappear from the internet. It would simply circulate in sort of other circles, arguably feeding, conspiracy narratives about how certain ideas are sort of all of a sudden, again, completely cancelled from scientific discourse. And so, just to summarize, I think that of the many possible new forms of amendments that we might consider, removal should not be one of them, because first of all, editors already have means to cancel, and I don't use this word casually, an article if they feel that it is appropriate to do so. And again, I'm not going actually to dispute whether we should or should not be doing so, but this is already happening. And it happens with the usual means of retractions. If they wanted to completely sort of unpublish or not publish an article, again, they can do that already. But introducing a formal removal category is going to invite an arbitrary use of them in a way that it's, I think, quite clearly problematic. It would formalize a form of what I would call scientific book burning, a form of sort of complete censorship of scientific information, again, around criteria that are quite negotiable. And finally, it would, at any rate, even if that was agreed to be a desirable outcome, it wouldn't achieve it anyhow, and therefore it would actually backfire in many ways. And this is all I had to say. I hope there will be time to hear a few comments and thoughts around these topics, because I'm really looking forward to them. So thank you very much.
So this is going to be interesting. I have a little bit to say about our experience with term removal. So the title of this is Crossmark Star-Crossed. And for those of you who do not know what Crossmark is a service that we at Crossref have provided since 2012 And this is the official description of it. It's a button that gives readers quick and easy access to the current status of an item, including any corrections, retractions, or updates to that record. The only thing I would modify about this is that it also gives machines quick access to this. Looking at this definition, you might think, well, okay, wait a minute, don't we have a mechanism for alerting people to the spread of retracted information? And the answer is a qualified yes, but clearly we wouldn't be having this conversation and Jody wouldn't be doing this research if Crossmark had been a complete success. And it hasn't been. It hasn't, I don't think, been a failure either. But I think that there are a lot of things that we can learn from our experience so far, and I just wanted to highlight some of these. For those of you who still might not know what Crossmark is, you may have seen this button on PDFs and on landing pages. It certainly has made some famous headlines recently. I was very happy to see this. But I should give you a little bit of the history of Crossmark, because I think it illustrates some of the problems that we had originally in defining it and some of the problems that I think we're going to face in the future as we continue to try and address this issue of retracted information. I joined Crossref in 2007, and when I joined, I was told, I was joined as the Director of Strategic Initiatives, and I was told that there were two things that we really needed to address quickly. One of them was retractions, and the other was author identifiers. After joining in 2007, we got down to looking at the question of, there were two problems I was told that I needed to address. One was actually, not retractions, but plagiarism. And the second was author identifiers. So I spent my first year at Crossref looking at the issue of plagiarism, trying to figure out how we could provide a service to help publishers check content for plagiarism. And in a year later, in 2008, we launched a service called Cross-Check. Today, it's known as Similarity Check. And that system has been in use since then. But in that year, where we were exploring the issue of plagiarism, and we were talking to researchers, and we were talking to journals and publishers, it became really clear that plagiarism was a growing concern, a growing issue, and that one of the side effects of us launching a service to make it easier for people to detect plagiarism and other forms of fraud was that there was going to be an increase in retractions. At the time, I remember walking into a publisher's office and seeing this sign. I'm sorry about the blurry picture. Camera phones at this time were not the greatest. And this was kind of the state of the art of retraction notices at the time. This was on a bulletin board in their lobby. And we realized sort of at that time that notifying people about corrections to the literature and retractions was going to be a really, really big problem, and that we should address that. And so the third project that I started on in that year was to try and address this. Very early on, and again, I'm sorry about the blurry picture here, it's from a board paper. We called this project the version of record. And the idea was that we would create a mechanism whereby people in a standard form, machine readable and human readable, would indicate that a paper had been retracted. And this image here was in late 2007, and it shows that we were already thinking along the lines of Crossmark. But Crossmark itself didn't launch until 2012. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is, right? So let's compare these two timelines. I know that this is small, I'll highlight stuff, but if you look here at these blue arrows, the time between the sort of initial discussion of Similarity Check and the launch of Similarity Check was a year. Yet the time between the initial conception of Crossmark and the launch of Crossmark was about 5 years. And if you look at more recently, you'll see that the uptake of Similarity Check has been quite substantial. 61% of Crossref DOIs are indexed for Similarity Check, but only 0.14% of Crossref DOIs have Crossmark update information in them. What happened at the beginning? Why did it take so long to launch, and why such different results? I think that this might help us in the future as we discuss this problem some more. So what happened between 2008 and 2012? And the short answer is we argued. And we argued about a number of things, some of which didn't take long to argue about, and some of which took a lot longer to argue about. We argued about the scale of the problem. There were some who considered that the scale of the retraction problem was so small that Crossref really shouldn't be paying attention to it. Ironically, one of the major proponents of this view has had 2 mass retraction events, I think, at least since then, one involving thousands of papers. This argument was dispensed with fairly quickly by those people who were doing plagiarism checking. The second big argument was about the stigma, right? There was a very big concern that what we were going to do was just advertise the fallibility of publishers and publishing and the scholarly record, and that we were going to somehow damage the process of science through doing that. This again was pretty quickly dealt with. Just about everybody saw correction of the correction of the scholarly literature, including retraction, as being fundamental to what publishers needed to do. We argued about sort of bike shed issues. What color do we paint the bike shed? It's about the name of the service and about the design of the logo. But these again were fairly quickly dealt with. Mostly what we debated was recommended practice, all right, which is again something that's going to be taken up by the NISO thing. At the time, thankfully, and the second thing that we debated was the taxonomy. Thankfully, at the time, we had Irene Haynes's book come out. It had just come out recently, and most of the policies and most of sort of the practice that we recommended came directly out of this book. So, it emphasized that editors and journals had a duty to do this, that links should be set up between the thing that was being retracted and the retraction notice, that corrections should be in citable form. Critically, she defined corrections, including retractions, as anything that could affect the paper, the interpretation or crediting of the paper, right? This was the sort of working definition of corrections that we used that turned out to be very important. They recommended that removals should be avoided except in very special circumstances, and that replacement should be avoided altogether. And so that left us with the taxonomy, which we debated and debated and debated until we eventually gave up. We debated it because so many publishers had so many different practices and so many definitions, so many different definitions of the terminology. And so what we decided to do was launch Crossmark and not enforce a taxonomy and see what emerged. And this had some predictable results. And the predictable results were this: if you go to the Crossref API and you do a search on it and do a facet on the update types, you'll get, and I just selected the top 25 here, but you'll see that you get this wide variety of classifications that people have used, right? And you see just plain ordinary, and this is sort of a prettier view of it, and you see plain ordinary sloppiness, but you also see sort of just, redundancy. Things that really could probably are needlessly splitting things that could be grouped. This, clearly became a problem very quickly, and it's not surprising, right? Because when you look at some of the definitions of these terms, they tend to be sort of circular and nested in a way, right? Erratum are a form of corrections, corrigendum are a form of corrections, retractions are a form of withdrawal. And if you think about it, we've got this sort of weird, like nested doll thing. A removal is a form of a retraction, which is a form of a correction, which is a form of an update, which triggers a version change. And then sometimes you've got these things that sit off on the side here, things that, like publisher notes and comments, which were also included there. And so in 2014, we standardized and we came up with this list, which I still think includes redundancy and some things that could be cleaned up. But since then, we've worked with this list in the taxonomy, and nobody can actually choose anything outside of this list. So the second question, in addition to why did it take so long, was why such different results? And I think I have a pretty straightforward answer to this, and this points to the fundamental education role that this NISO group is going to have to play, which is the stigma needs to be addressed, right? Clearly, I'm not saying that retraction is an acceptable thing all the time and that it doesn't have to be considered a serious event. But journals have to realize that it is their role to retract things, that retracting things isn't something to be ashamed of. This is part of their job, and they should take it seriously, and they should advertise it very clearly when it's done. So much of the resistance that we've had from the community, by and large, has had something to do with the stigma associated with it, and there not being any clear indication from the community that this is in fact what is expected, right? Obviously within reasonable bounds of every journal. And that in fact, you'd end up being suspicious of a journal that never retracted anything or that never corrected anything that it published. So what have we learned since we launched Crossmark? And what are, and obviously these things are informing our future of Crossmark and how we think about its evolution. One thing that we learned was that publisher workflows treat corrections and retractions on an ad hoc basis, right? They were not at the time, and this has improved since then, automated in a way where they could be done consistently across the board in publishers. Another thing that we learned was that there was so much debate and so much proprietariness about how publications looked, right? That we probably would have saved a lot of effort if we'd focused mostly on machine actionability and let other people, citation manager tools, search engines, and so on and so forth, take care of the flagging and displaying of retracted items in the tools that researchers were using every day, rather than try and force publishers to do that in a consistent way. That the required metadata should include a summary, that corrections to the scholarly literature should be open, that we really, really, really need to keep the taxonomy simple. And when I say simple, I mean something as straightforward as this, and I realize this is geared specifically towards journals and other serials and not towards books, but I think starting with something like this would be a good thing. Corrections combining errata and corrigenda, which most people do not make a distinction between, unfortunately, but that is the reality. And in the case of retraction, I think we have to acknowledge a number of things. The first is that retraction takes a long time. It is a very convoluted process, and we need something to indicate that something is going on. And so expression of concern seems to me something that's really worth preserving for that. We need to also be able to partially destigmatize retractions that are done based on the goodwill of the researcher discovering, honest mistakes and problems with the literature. And so things like partial retractions and self-retractions, I think, help with that. And on to this issue of removal, and Irene Haynes in her book talks about removal and the problematic aspects of it. And I think I agree with the assessment that removal is a hugely controversial thing and could be abused. The only thing I'd say is that I think that there is a fundamental difference between sort of the print world, where something could be removed and yet not physically removed, right? Because it was actually existing in libraries. And libraries had some control over who could access literature that had been removed because it was dangerous or otherwise, but that no longer exists in the sort of when the literature is public and out there in electronic form. I think it's a very complicated issue. From a practical point of view, I think you'll get a lot of pushback if you eliminate the option of removal, but I think it should be policed very heavily. And then the other thing that we have to do is you do not charge extra for doing something that you consider to be best practice. One of the biggest mistakes we made with Crossmark was charging our members extra for participating in Crossmark. We removed that fee a few years ago, and we're going to start, encouraging our members to participate again in this new regime, but this was a big mistake. And then another one was that we can harness the community to make the stigma of not reporting retractions greater than the stigma of reporting them. And this is something that Retraction Watch has done exceedingly well. And I think that we really have to learn from that because this is an important thing if we're going to convince publishers and preprint servers and so on and so forth, that this is an important thing for them to take care of, is correcting the scholarly literature. And then finally, I have two personal observations. One of the things that I don't think is talked about enough is the liability issues and how much that drives publisher behavior with retractions. The vast majority of our publishers are small, tiny publishers, and any kind of legal interaction could put them out of business almost immediately. And I think that the industry really has to think creatively about how we help any publisher be able to take the risk of retracting stuff and not face the sort of the existential risk every time they correct the scholarly literature or retract something. And then the second thing, and this has been observed a lot, is that the root of the publication misconduct and fraud is the use of publications as a proxy for productivity and the resulting publication pressure there. So much of this is driven by that pressure, and the more that we can do to address that pressure, the less of a problem we're going to have with publication and fraud and misconduct and fraud. Obviously, this is going to be informing our evolution of Crossmark in the future. So please check Crossref for updates to Crossmark. And that's it for me. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you to all our speakers. We have some questions, but I'm going to take advantage of being the chair to ask the first question. And I directed initially to Dr. Finelli, but if you have observations, the other two panelists, I'd be interested in hearing them. I remember when I studied my positivist philosophy of science, how facts are value neutral and scientific methodology is value neutral. We live in such loaded ideological times, both from the right and in terms of identity politics, that how do you come up with some kind of criteria of what is bogus and what's scientifically meritorious in these kinds of political questions with respect to scientific inquiry? You've got three good examples there of how problematic this is. So.
Right. So the short answer is that you can't, and this is precisely sort of a key aspect of my argument against removal. The idea being that certain areas of scholarship might view the work done in other areas as completely bogus, and that alone will tell you that, again, it becomes if we allowed this to determine what can and cannot be published a priori, then you would enter into an absurd power struggle between sort of different factions, or again, sort of different strains of ideology that can come and go and change over time. And that's not how scholarship can function and look like. And so everyone is entitled to their own opinion and to their own critique. And it is already the case that any journal editor, I would hope, that considers an article to be bogus, let alone receiving comments along those lines from reviewers, will not publish the article to begin with. So there is gatekeeping in that regard already. But again, within a particular discipline, what is deemed to be valid scientific argument cannot, or at least ought not to be sort of contested again on ideological grounds from somewhere else. And so this is why, again, I think there is obviously sort of a lot of good work to be done to help any particular scientific community make progress. I was saying police itself, but I don't like that phrase either. But you see what I mean, right? Sort of, make sure that the quality of our literature is upheld. But what worries me fundamentally about the idea of removal is that of introducing a formal category of removal is that it seems to formalize this idea that somehow it is perfectly legitimate to disagree with a scientific publication and want it to disappear entirely from view. And so again, it becomes, it's all easy. I think it's too easy to say what Jeffrey suggested, obviously wisely, to say, well, it should be heavily policed. That's not good enough, again, because no one holds the truth. No one really can know what's true and what's not. And so the only way that we can keep surviving intellectually is to allow the free markets of ideas to regulate itself.
I don't know if Jody or Jeff, you want to respond to this?
Just that I think it is a real risk that we suppress information, and how to distinguish between useful information that talks about what are the current norms, whether they're ethical norms or whether they're epistemologically based sort of norms or beliefs about what we think is correct at the moment in the literature, and I think that reducing the extent to which we remove material entirely, especially when it's the digital world is certainly different from the print world. We have the sense that nothing ever disappears once it's in electronic form. It's not entirely true, and it's certainly how the information is indexed, even if it does still exist somewhere. How you find it can be really difficult, even for material that's in a web archive somewhere. So I think that I would like us to be able to distinguish between the literature that's sort of alive, or in whatever way, from the literature that is of kind of historical interest, without removing things entirely. I don't deal with the sorts of pragmatic and legal challenges that some folks do. So I know it may not be possible to completely avoid takedowns, but to the extent that we can not incentivize that and find alternatives, that would be better.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so I think that there's one thing, and I'm sure that people know this, but it's worth sort of repeating, that is that removal doesn't necessarily mean disappeared, right? In other words, there's supposed to be a metadata record that indicates that something was there once, right? And that gives you, some information about it and so on. And I absolutely, again, with, both what Daniel and Jody are saying, acknowledge that this, removing content, not disappearing it, but removing it, can be vastly abused. The problem I have, right, is we're practically just going into this effort in NISO, is to get people to, some publishers are going to be ordered by governments or worse to remove things from sites, right? Mm. And if they don't have a principled mechanism in which to do that, it's going to be worse, because then it really might be disappeared, yes, as opposed to leaving some sort of a metadata wake that might be followed up in the future. That's the concern that I would have, and it just, as a practical matter, I can't imagine. I can't imagine organizations that have faced these kinds of requests, endorsing a standard that doesn't include that as a sort of as some sort of an escape hatch. That's, I guess, what I'd say.
Thanks very much, all of you. Yeah, I think as somebody who's got a PhD in philosophy, if people were upset about racist and sexist thought in the history of ideas in philosophy, they really truncate a lot of stuff that's been done over the last 1,000 years. So yes, the next question is a clarification question, and I think because of the taxonomy, it was initially directed to Daniel, but I think it's a broad enough question that anyone can answer it. And it's a request for clarification about how retraction with replacement is used.
Yeah, so I actually did answer that in writing quickly. The idea that is a practice that exists already in many journals, where a new version is issued, basically. So the old article, I think, usually is kept again on record, but the new version becomes the official article. And the idea is therefore to have a tag that highlights this fact, as opposed to simply the article being retracted or merely corrected. I'm not sure if that is the doubt. Can I just pick up on another thing that Jeff mentioned, and two questions actually were about the issue of legal requests, because actually, incidentally, just a few minutes before we started, I removed part of the argument in favor because it seemed too long on the slide, but actually it included indeed the argument that there might be legal requests to remove content, and therefore sort of that's part of the argument for a removal category. sort of the response to that would be that clearly there are ways to do that already that don't entail a formal new removal category. And surely there are ways to incorporate that practice either in a sort of a standard retraction or a retraction with removal, where all that's going to happen is that you replace the article with, let's say, a blank version. You don't leave the old version and just you leave it like that. So I think there would be ways to accommodate those requests, which I hope are going to be few. Again, if we enter into an epoch in which the government regularly asks for scientific content to be removed quite arbitrarily, then again, we are in deep trouble, and it's something we shouldn't endorse. But for the occasional rare sort of urgent matter, I think there are ways to do it without having to create a new category.
We actually have a number of questions about the removal category. I'll try to summarize the differences, and then perhaps we can have a thorough discussion of the issues. One person says, what about when a publisher needs to take an article down completely for legal reasons? Is that covered in the recommendations? Another person said, thank you for, and this was directed to Dr. Finelli, for a thought-provoking and concise tour of a really complex topic. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the intersection of legal obligations and publication ethics with respect to removal. So again, it's essentially the same kind of comment and question. Could legal obligations be the grounds for removal? And would it be possible, on which grounds to?
Yes, so those were the questions I was addressing just now.
Yes.
That was definitely discussed in the subcommittee. The argument for not having the removal, if you like, is that those kind of requests, hopefully rare, would fall under, could be accommodated in the current system anyhow. That's the short answer.
Jody, you said you want to speak to this?
No, but I just want to draw attention to Renee Hawk has a follow-up question about interpreting Danielle's comments as being opposed to retraction with removal, but then it sounds like from what you just said that's not the case. So maybe you want to clarify that a little bit more. So retraction with removal, is it something that we should have, shouldn't have? What's the situation with that?
So, okay, if I was the king of the world, I would have no removals whatsoever. As was mentioned, there are conceivable cases in which, first of all, there is sort of a genuine, objective, immediate threat to public safety. Something, I can't imagine exactly what that would look like that hadn't been picked up before publication. But let's say that's the case. And let's say, therefore, that there is a legal mandate, or whatever kind that is, that we all are going to find morally and ethically and legally justified, and therefore the publisher needs to take that content completely off the record. Then there are ways in which, with a system in which we have retractions and retractions with replacement, that can be done in ways that wouldn't confuse our taxonomy and our metadata too much. And again, as I stressed, I would still advocate for those cases to be extremely rare and extremely difficult cases. Again, if that became the norm in whatever form, that's something that should concern us all anyhow.
The next question looks like it's directed to Jeff. It's, can and does Crossmark work on preprints?
So Crossmark can work on preprints. Traditionally, I think so it can. At the moment, I don't think it does, but we're fixing that. The reason that it didn't was that there, at least at one point, was a clear dividing line, and that and there probably still is, right? And that a preprint server will not claim to retract something given that they didn't actually, quote, accept something. However, they do need to sometimes sort of, I hate to say it, remove something. And they also may end up correcting stuff. And so, with the increasing importance of preprints in the community, I think conveying status changes in these things is important to everybody. But I do think that a lot of the sort of conventions around what preprints, preprint servers and so on and so forth are going to do and what responsibilities are going to take are evolving, and we're going to have to evolve with them.
Anyone else want to? Yeah, go ahead, Jody.
Yeah, one fantastic use case for Crossmark on preprints is connecting to a published article when that happens. Earlier this week, I was looking at a news article quoting a preprint. I looked at it. It was in the comments that I found the actual published article. It was not something that the authors or the preprint server had yet curated, even though many are doing that. But trying to get beyond the manual there into, you know, a Crossmark button you could click on, and is it published? Where is it published? Can you find it? You know, that would also, I mean, in addition to all of these issues around withdrawal or whatnot, that would be super helpful.
Yeah, I mean, the Crossref guidelines stipulate that, you know, preprints should link to the published version when it's known, and that they should do so prominently and so on. But obviously there's a bit of a race condition there, right? Which is that it's sometimes hard, particularly if the title changes or the authorship changes, to actually identify what the follow-on article is in an automated way that's reliable and so on and so forth. So there's quite a labor-intensive thing, but they are, and so it can sometimes be quite delayed if they do it. Yeah.
We have a comment and a question for Daniel. Thank you for the clarification. I interpreted your comments as being opposed to retraction with removal. It seems that you just said that that's not the case.
Thank you, Deborah. I think that was the comment that Jody highlighted and that I addressed just in my last answer.
So I have a question for Daniel. What, I mean, I'm just not clear on what the difference as far as process would be between a removal and a retraction with removal.
So I'm not sure what you mean by the process.
Well, in other words, what from a user experience, what's the difference between what they see and what they would other than
with a removal? What we're discussing about is a case in which, as you mentioned, the content is no longer there for anyone to see.
Right.
As you know, whether an ordinary retraction is watermarked, but it's still there. And the removal is just a blank slate, which again, you could have that physically done without introducing a new category. But that said, again, it would be problematic for all the reasons that we said. Does that?
Right. Sorry. So what's retraction with removal? I mean, is that a category that a separate thing that you're defining?
As opposed to?
It was with replacement, actually.
Oh, it was with replacement.
With replacement, yes.
Oh, okay, fine. Okay, fine.
I don't want to stop this dialogue, but we're at the end of our time, and I just have time to thank you all the presenters, and thank all the people who attended and asked questions. And I'd really like to thank all the staff of COPE who've been working really hard to have what has traditionally been a face-to-face seminar, series of seminars, and to do this virtually given our pandemic. So thanks everybody. It's been very enjoyable to chair and listen to. And best wishes for the rest of your days, folks. Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.